31st of January, 1702. While French Marshal Villeroy returns from Milan after his previous defeat at Chiari the previous year, he is urgently informed that Prince Eugene was marching along the Oglio River with 4,500 men, as well as another 5,000 under Vaudémont Jr. Fearing his outpost there would be overrun, he dispatched orders to intercept. Instead, Eugene veered off course with a very different target in mind: Villeroy's headquarters in Cremona itself. In the ensuing battle, the half-asleep French troops hastily sprung from their barracks to fight back, but were overwhelmed by Imperial grenadiers. As more and more Imperial troops poured into the city, the Irish Brigade managed to fiercely throw back a series of attacks by Eugene's army, but with heavy losses. After a few more hours of confused street fighting, Eugene withdrew, having lost 266 men killed, 200 men wounded, and 340 men taken prisoner. The French would lose 562 men killed, 538 men wounded, and 301 more as prisoners. The Irish paid a particularly high price, having lost 350 of their 600 engaged. The French also lost 5 standards, as well as 500 horses. Finally, among the men captured was the Duke of Villeroy himself. Although their toll in the defense of Cremona was high, the French were proud that they had driven off the Imperialists whilst outnumbered and taken by surprise. The king, happy with the conduct of his soldiers, rewarded them with a month's worth of pay. As for Eugene, he would not keep Villeroy for very long, quickly releasing him back to Louis, who decided now was the best time to choose yet another commander for the Italian theater. This time he chose the most capable Duke of Vendôme, a charismatic, experienced, aggressive, and above all, successful commander. Eugene, unable to follow up on a series of victories due to shortages of supplies and men, instead began the year's campaign with a blockade on the city of Mantua, one of the keys to securing northern Italy. Vendôme intended to relieve the blockaded city by placing pressure on the imperial garrisons at Borgoforte and Guastalla, forcing Eugene's understrength battalions to turn and face them somewhere in the area. If successful, the offensive could result in the destruction of the only imperial army in Italy. On July 25th, Vendôme had finally begun his offensive on the east bank of the Po River. Leading one corps of 20,000 men, he would be joined personally by the 35,000-strong corps of the Bourbon Spanish king, Philip V. In response, Eugene ordered a concentration of forces around the area into a corps led by Annibale Visconti. He was to gather 2,800 men that had previously been dispersed in the area at the small town of Santa Vittoria, located 7 miles south of Guastalla, then retire if attacked. But that was not to be, for Vendôme had played Eugene's subordinate. The next day, Vendôme set off at 11 a.m. with a vanguard of 4,000 men in 2 columns. The talented François de Albragota marched up the dike of the Crostolo stream to the left of Vendôme's own column, which marched up the road to the Visconti's camp. The camp guards spotted them and urgently sounded the alarm. After waking the rest of the camp, 100 Imperial horsemen advanced against the French in a vain effort to slow them down. These men were easily driven back toward the encampment, which Vendôme found to be in complete disorder. There he found most of the horses of the Imperial cavalry still grazing. He ordered an immediate attack at this critical moment, and the French quickly advanced on the Imperials. The Imperialists, posted along lightly fortified houses, offered stiff resistance for a moment. The Imperial cavalry were barely mounting by the time the French squadrons charged them down. These cuirassiers broke and fled across the Tesson de Canal's only bridge, which rapidly became packed with Imperial troops and baggage. The Prince Commercy had heard the sound of battle in Guastalla, and, marching to the sound of the guns, arrived with the Herbeville Dragoons. But their arrival was too late. The French had already passed the bridge and poured onto the plain. Undaunted, a gallant charge by the Herbeville Dragoons managed to retake the bridge, but could not advance further for the French were in total control of the opposite bank. A frustrated Vendôme launched a counterattack to retake it, but the Dragoons managed to drive them back at the cost of many men. Their gallant efforts were still nevertheless in vain, as Commercy could not stop the Imperial cuirassiers from routing. The battle would end in a resounding French victory. The Imperialists had lost 500 men killed or wounded, and 300 more would be taken prisoners. In addition, 1,000 horses and 16 standards had been seized by Vendôme, all for a cost of 120 to 200 men killed or wounded. With a victory at Santa Vittoria, Vendôme had communicated to Eugene that he enjoyed overall superiority over them, as he could afford to campaign on both sides of the Po, threaten Eugene wherever he wished, and compel Eugene to abandon the blockade of Mantua. In addition, the victory enabled Vendôme and Philip to move on Guastalla and Borgoforte, which they easily laid siege to. Now Eugene would have no choice but to concentrate his forces and face Vendôme in a pitched battle if he were to retain the initiative. From the 1st to the 14th of August, Eugene's hussars led the army in search of the two commanders. The location of Philip V's corps outside of Borgoforte was known, but Vendôme's was not. On the 7th, Eugene wrote to the Emperor, "From day to day I wait a great battle. God make it so for the service of our august Lord." His prayers were answered, as on the 9th his hussars engaged in a sharp skirmish with the French patrols around the area of Luzzara. At 8 a.m. on August 15th, Vendôme had encircled the castle of Luzarra with his vanguard, which had been garrisoned by 400 men of the Young Down Infantry Regiment. All of them refused to surrender. After detaching troops to encircle it, he began deploying the first line of his army, with the left under General Albergata on the dike of the Po River, his center under his own command, and the Marquis of Créqui north of the town itself and in front of the Augustine convent. And lastly, the right under Lieutenant General Tessi, anchored on the Castello Gonzaga. Vendôme's left flank was beneficial, as the Po and his right flank could react to any flanking maneuver with the reserves. But it was dangerously thin. Most of the Bourbon army had yet to actually reach Luzzara, and units would arrive piecemeal throughout the day. For now, his only second line was the cavalry, which doubly served as his only reserve. In contrast, Eugene intended on the coordinated arrival of his columns to launch a surprise assault on the Bourbon army. The Imperials marched in two main columns, with the Prince of Commercy leading the right wing, and Eugene himself on the left, hoping to prevent Vendôme from fully deploying. Instead, it would take 4.5 more hours for Commercy to align with the columns of Eugene and Starhemberg, as well as the second line of the Imperial right wing to arrive. Eugene's overall plan was to fix the French front, and thus envelop their flanks. Vendôme spurred into action, ordering the army drummers to sound the assembly. The sound of drums, bugles, shouting men, and rattling equipment echoed throughout the whole line as men raced to fill the ranks of their battalions and mount their squadrons. All elements of surprise had been lost, but Eugene was not deterred. It was now that he would have the trusted Commercy begin the first attack on Vendôme's left. 2 cannon shots signaled the cannonade, and the beginning of the Battle of Luzzara. After an hour-long artillery duel from both sides, Commercy's battalions advanced, chanting "Hurrah! Hurrah!" to meet those of Albragata. The Imperial troops advanced quickly, supported by a few cavalry squadrons, with all disregard to enemy fire until they had come within range of the Royal Vassaux and Piedmont regiments. In the first French salvos, Commercy himself had been mortally wounded by several musket balls. It would be several more hours until he succumbed to his wounds. Despite the demoralizing death of their loved general, the Imperialists kept the advance in a great display of discipline. But as they inched closer and closer, the rolling fire would become too great, and in good timing, the Santerre Dragoon Regiment launched a flanking attack on the confused Imperialists, momentarily driving their battalions and squadrons away in confusion. Some of the French infantry followed and created an unplanned counterattack. The Dragoons kept their momentum and managed to capture 2 battalion guns, but their success was temporary. The Imperialists quickly rallied as the Bagny and Herberstein regiments filled the ranks of those who had fled. In a short time, their line belched a sheet of flame, and the French dragoons fell back to their original positions. To the sound of "the charge," they once again advanced against the French, first meeting with the elite Dillon's Irish regiment. But like the previous men, they also fell in the crossfire between the Irishmen and the other 2 infantry regiments. Again, the Imperialists began to waver. Prince Eugene, having learned of the death of his dear friend Commercy, had ridden over to the right wing, where he was met with the cheers of now reinvigorated men. At this critical moment, he retired them and replaced them with the Danish Brigade, the Guttenstein Infantry Regiment, and the Schereni Dragoons. But reinforcement from the Danes would enable the Imperials to finally overrun them, who, despite fighting tenaciously, would lose 2 colors in the terrible melee. The following Perche and Soule regiments, attacked on both their fronts and flanks, also gave way, followed soon after by the men of the Grancy Infantry Regiment. Eugene pressed his left far into the French, eventually pushing them back to Luzzara itself. Now the Piedmont, Vaisseau regiments had become isolated from the rest of the army. Philip V, arriving from Borgoforte that morning, would distinguish himself here for the first time in battle. He gathered the cavalry regiments, the last reserve on the left, and advanced with them. With a gallant charge, it was these regiments that would ultimately blunt Eugene's ferocious efforts and save the Bourbon left flank. But they could not relieve the battalions still trapped further ahead. By 9 p.m., most combat on this flank had died down. When the Imperial right wing assaulted the Franco-Spanish left at 6 p.m., the simultaneous assaults went through on the center and Franco-Spanish right wing. Advancing to the cries of "Victory! Victory!" would they manage to close in at bayonet point, bringing the Bourbon troops to their breaking point and capturing a color of one of the regiments. It was thanks to the cold-blooded Vendôme that the center held on as he rode up and down the line, encouraging the bravery of his troops. A limited counterattack conducted by Créqui managed to recapture 2 battalion guns, as well as drive away the Imperialists in a momentary rout, but at the cost of his own life. In the center too, the gunfire died down as darkness approached. From Eugene's left wing, Field Marshal Stachenberg advanced with a line of infantry around 6 p.m. With him was a strong cavalry corps under Vaudémont Jr. on his left, and even more behind the infantry as a reserve. His advance would meet a strong opposition for the Franco-Spanish infantry and cavalry division on Vendôme's right flank were entrenched. When the Imperial infantry could not break through, a small artillery battery was brought up close to the front line, where they would pour a hail of grape shot into the enemy. The Imperial gunners blew gaps into the 5-man deep battalions of the French, but even in the face of close-range artillery fire, the Bourbon infantry remained undaunted. In response, Stachenberg attempted to use his cavalry reserve to outflank the Castello Gonzaga, Thessi brought up the carabineers, dismounted them, and immediately fired into the ranks of the flanking reserve cavalry. By 9 p.m., it was gradually becoming more and more difficult to contain the flanking movement of Starhemberg's reserve cavalry. This was until Vendôme again personally intervened to the cheers of his men. Vendôme then had the newly arrived Irish Albemarle regiment and the elite gendarmerie relieve the carabineers. The Irish advanced against the Imperial left flank as the elite gendarmerie charged their front and discharged their pistols. And by 9 p.m., Starhemberg drove the Bourbon troops out of their entrenchments. Although, thanks to the coolness displayed by their marshal, they did not break. Instead, the right wing fell back closer to Luzzara. Driven almost only by inertia did some fighting continue until midnight. Under cover of darkness, the French battalions cut off on the extreme left slipped back toward friendly lines at 2 a.m. on the 16th. For 25 hours, they had essentially been marching and fighting uninterrupted. As soldiers on both sides fell asleep where they stood, the darkness of night would mark the end of the killing. But neither side backed down from the field. Although the Imperials managed to capture some of the Franco-Spanish line, they had not driven them from the field. Instead, the two armies would continue to follow and face one another for weeks, neither side wishing to back down, but also not willing to engage in another pitched battle. The Bourbon powers suffered 400 men killed, 1,800 wounded, and 6 colors lost. Among the dead lay many officers, including the Lieutenant General Créqui. Eugene's forces, in contrast, lost 791 men killed, including 56 officers and the Field Marshal Commercy, a dear friend of Prince Eugene. In addition, he would also lose 1,905 men to wounds, 4 men missing, 2 cannon, and 1 color. The campaign in Italy seemed thus far indecisive, but it was anything but. Eugene had failed to drive his opponents off the fields of Luzzara, but he had effectively retained imperial control of the Po and Mincio rivers, and kept Vendôme from relieving the beleaguered Mantua. His worsening logistical situation as a result of Vienna's ignorance would be the main issue holding him back from the rest of the year. The apathy of those in the Imperial War Council had cost him a grand opportunity to destroy the Bourbons in a decisive action. Such a lack of control may be what propelled him to later become president of said council. The Battle of Luzzara effectively marked the first time Eugene had not won a battle in independent command. He had not lost, but did not win. Vendôme had proven himself a worthy opponent of the Little Prince. He had held simultaneous assaults while parts of his army arrived piecemeal, and mentored Philip V on the art of battle, though he was not able to drive Eugene off the field either. On September 9th, Guastalla fell to the Bourbons. In December, Borgoforte fell. Both sides prepared for the next year's offensives, but as we know, the next phase in the Italian campaign would occur on the diplomatic table as reluctant allies like Victor Amadeus II of Savoy, reconsidered his allegiances to the French. Now the eyes of Europe shifted away to the new theaters of war, which would ultimately be shown the spotlight for the next 2 years, these being Flanders and Germany.